The sunset gradually descended, casting a soft amber glow across the white walls of Melissa Carter's small home. The ceiling fan hummed steadily in the stillness, blending with the faint rustle of leaves outside, creating a serene melody. Yet inside Melissa's study, that stillness was fractured by something indefinable, an uneasy, haunting weight that hung in the air. She stood before her, trembling fingers gripping a paintbrush. Though no stroke had yet been made on the unfinished canvas, Melissa, with her softly curled brown hair cascading over her shoulders, resembled a statue frozen in time. The light from the desk lamp illuminated her face, highlighting her deep, shadowed eyes heavy with fragments of memories she had long tried to bury. The door to the room was slightly ajar, a detail she wasn't sure was accidental or deliberate. Melissa exhaled deeply and placed the paintbrush down on the table. Her hand brushed over the collar of her thin blouse, as if attempting to wipe away the heaviness clinging to her skin. A wave of emptiness surged within her, relentless and overwhelming, washing away any trace of focus. She couldn't paint, she couldn't concentrate. She couldn't feel the hollow ache inside her. Leaning back into her chair, Melissa's gaze drifted to the window, past the dimly lit street leading to the quiet neighborhood beyond. Lucas, her ex-husband's young brother, had mentioned earlier that he would be home late tonight. His absence granted her solitude, the kind of silence she thought she craved it. Yet she couldn't deny the strange comfort of his presence, brought. Even the sound of his steady footsteps through the house had somehow kept her loneliness at bay. With her hand absent-mindedly brushed the silver bracelet on her wrist, a gift from her ex-husband. Her eyes fluttered closed as his image surfaced, unbidden, his calculated smile. The honeyed lies, the eventual betrayal. Melissa drew in a deep breath, but it felt shallow, as if her chest had constricted. She whispered to herself, "It's all in the past." But the words didn't really comfort her. Then, just outside her door, she heard the faintest sound of movement in the hallway. Melissa's eyes flew open, her heartbeat quickening. She tried to ignore it, thinking it must have been the wind. But as her gaze shifted toward the door, she noticed that it was moving slowly and purposefully, as if it had been nudged open by an invisible hand. Lucas stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light spilling in from the living room. His youthful face was sharp and defined, and his bright eyes held something unspoken, something that sent a chill down Melissa's spine. He locked his gaze on her eyes, not just by chance, but with intent. "I thought you needed something," Lucas said softly, his voice low but clear, almost as if to justify his presence. Yet Melissa knew he had seen her. He had seen her vulnerability, the unease she had tried so hard to keep hidden, and perhaps even the yearning she had fought to suppress. The silence stretched between them, only seconds passing, but weighted with an eternity's worth of tension. Melissa rose slowly from her chair, taking a tentative step toward the door. But her feet felt as though they were anchored to the floor. The air seemed thicker now, charged, as if the room itself had become a cage for everything they were too afraid to admit. She forced a smile, a frail attempt at normality. But Lucas's penetrating stare seemed to strip away every mask she wore. "It's nothing," she said, her voice hollow, empty even to her own ears. Lucas inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her words, yet his expression betrayed his doubt. His gaze lingered a second too long, as though he were grappling with a truth. He wasn't ready to speak then. Without another word, he turned and walked away. Melissa remained frozen, her heart pounding. In the aftermath of his departure, through the hallway beyond her door had fallen silent. The atmosphere still lingered in the room, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. Something had shifted, unspoken but undeniable. And Melissa knew with a chilling certainty that whatever had begun tonight would not end here. Melissa closed the door to her study after Lucas left. Yet the air in the room still felt trapped in her chest. She leaned against the door with her hands trembling as they brushed against her chest, trying to steady her breathing. But nothing came easily. Her emotions surged inside her, chaotic and untamed, like a painting smeared beyond recognition. She moved toward the window, her gaze unfocused as it drifted to the small yard outside. Old memories crept in, uninvited yet overpowering in their clarity. She saw herself younger, her softly curled hair cascading over her shoulders as she stood in this very house. But back then she wasn't alone. A man had once walked into this space as if it were his forever. James, her ex-husband. They had once been madly in love. James was the man Melissa had believed she would spend the rest of her life with. Him was charming and intelligent and full of life. the very qualities that had captivated her from the moment they met Melissa, who had given up everything for him, abandoning a rising career in interior design to marry him and build a family. Back then she had believed she had it all. But those years had been nothing more than a fleeting dream. James wasn't the man he appeared to be after 3 years of marriage. Melissa discovered his infidelity. At first it was the small things: hastened and ended phone calls, mysterious text messages lighting up his screen. And then one night, when she decided to confront the truth, she realized she was just one name among many on his list of important people. Melissa remembered vividly the day she confronted James in this very house. His eyes showed no remorse, only a faint hint of arrogance, as though he believed she would forgive him because she had no other choice. But she didn't. Despite her shattered heart, Melissa chose to leave, taking with her the unbearable pain. She never thought she could survive. The divorce didn't just strip her of the love she once trusted, it stole her belief in herself. Her eyes left the yard and fell on her work. Where her unfinished paintings lay scattered after the divorce, art had become her sole refuge. Each brushstroke was her way of speaking the truth she couldn't voice yet. Even art couldn't fully heal the scars etched into her heart. And then Lucas entered her life. At first, Lucas, James's younger brother, moving in with her had seemed like a temporary arrangement. He needed a place to stay during his internship, and she couldn't refuse given their amicable relationship. But the longer he stayed, the more unsettled Melissa became. The more Lucas reminded her of James, not in his appearance, but in the small things. The way he tilted his head when he was deep in thought, the way he moved with a quiet yet decisive grace. But Lucas wasn't James. He was different and youthful, passionate and dangerous in a way Melissa had never anticipated. What unsettled Melissa even more was the way Lucas looked at her. Unlike James's calculating gaze, Lucas's eyes seemed to search for something deeper, something hidden within her, a part of herself she wasn't sure she wanted uncovered. He brought with him a sense of familiarity that felt foreign, a paradox that left her feeling unnoticed. Melissa turned back to the easel, her fingers brushing against the unfinished canvas. She wanted to paint, to do something, to break free from the whirlpool of memories. But she couldn't. Her hands trembled as she recalled Lucas's gaze, the way it lingered, unspoken yet undeniably present. She didn't understand what was happening. But deep down, Melissa knew one thing for certain. Lucas wasn't the problem. It was her own loneliness. Her unhealed wounds pulling her into a spiral. She wasn't sure she could escape. The shadows of her past seemed to intertwine with the light of her present, blurring the lines between what was real and what wasn't. But one truth stood out, sharp and undeniable. Lucas's presence had awakened something in her, something she had buried long ago, and now Melissa wasn't sure she could control it. Melissa closed the door to her study, but the tension from Lucas's gaze lingered, spreading like a silent wave that clung to her. She walked slowly toward the kitchen, seeking some semblance of calm in the quiet night. The soft clink of glass filled the air as she poured herself a glass of red wine, the rich liquid swirling in warm hues under the dim light. Yet her heart remained cold, wrapped in a tangle of emotions she couldn't unravel. From Lucas appeared suddenly, his broad shoulders filling the kitchen doorway. "I wanted some quiet." "You're still up?" he questioned in a low voice, as though he didn't want to disturb Melissa's fragile stillness. Melissa turned, and as soon as their eyes connected, an unnamed tension seemed to take control of their space. He stared at her for a beat too long, with a quick gesture toward the bottle of wine on the counter. She answered, "Are you up for a glass?" Melissa couldn't help but notice the slight warmth emanating from Lucas, or the way the soft kitchen light deepened the intensity of his eyes as he nodded and stepped inside. She gave him a glass, but her hand trembled a little as his fingers touched hers. "Are you okay?" Melissa took a small step back, trying to steady herself, and said, "I'm fine." Though her voice lacked the conviction she'd hoped for, Lucas asked in a calm but quiet, concern-laced voice, and his gaze was sincere rather than probing. Melissa felt as though she was standing under a spotlight. "I'm not so sure about that." His words were gentle, but they carried a weight that I couldn't ignore since earlier today. "I can't get rid of the feeling that something changed between us." Melissa's eyes darted to Lucas's, and in that moment, it seemed like time had frozen the words. We shouldn't talk about this." Her voice faltered, barely holding together the wall she had spent so much time building. But Lucas took another step forward. closing the gap until they were just a breath apart. If we shouldn't, then why can't I stop thinking about you? And why can't you seem to look away from me? She felt as though she were teetering on the edge of a fragile line caught between what she knew was right and what her heart was yearning for. Lucas didn't press further. But the truth in his eyes said more than words ever could. There was sincerity, a closeness, and something far deeper that she couldn't bring herself to name. Lucas, you're so much younger than me, Melissa said softly, though even as the words left her lips, she knew they were more for herself than for him. I don't want to make a mistake. Age doesn't matter to me, Lucas replied, his voice unwavering. What matters is what I feel and what I'm certain you feel too. Melissa lowered her head, unable to find an answer. But when she finally looked up, Lucas's gaze hadn't wavered. It remained steady, warm, yet unyielding, silently reassuring her that everything would be okay if she could just let go of her fear. In that moment, Melissa didn't speak. She simply felt the warmth of Lucas's breath, drew closer, his presence like a storm quietly unraveling every defense she had tried to hold on to. But instead of an explosion, the moment lingered unhurried, like a single note suspended in the air. Melissa didn't know what would come next, but she also knew she no longer had the strength to run from what was real, whatever this was. Whatever it could, because she could no longer deny its pull. Melissa sat motionless in her study, her hands clenched tightly together as if trying to keep the storm of emotions inside her from spilling over. The soft glow of her desk lamp illuminated the unfinished painting before her, but the muted colors on the canvas couldn't mask the turmoil swirling in her mind. Lucas's image lingered in his penetrating gaze, the certainty in his voice, and the closeness she had felt, the kind of closeness she hadn't known in years of isolation. She tried to push it away, but the feelings burned inside her like a fire that only grew stronger the harder she fought to extinguish it. She stood abruptly, intending to pour another glass of wine to steady herself. But a soft knock at the door stopped her in her tracks. Her heart tightened. Melissa didn't need to ask who was on the other side. She already knew. And that was what unnerved her most. Come in, she said, her voice trembling as though she wasn't sure she wanted to say the words. The door creaked open, and Lucas appeared. The faint light from the hallway behind him cast shadows across his face, accentuating the sharp angles of his jawline and the softness in his expression, a curious mix of strength and vulnerability. He didn't step in immediately. Instead, he leaned against the door frame, his eyes fixed on hers. At that moment, neither of them spoke. But Melissa could feel the air between them growing heavy, dense with unspoken tension that seemed to press down on her chest. I couldn't sleep, Lucas said at last, his voice breaking the silence like a whisper through the stillness. You're not sleeping either. Melissa forced a smile, though it faltered almost immediately. She knew Lucas could see right through it. No, I just wanted a little time. I entered and carefully closed the door behind me. He didn't say anything else, but his slow, methodical approach to her made Melissa's heart race, quicken. She took an instinctive step back, her body pressing against the edge of the piece, her hands gripping its surface tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded in the face of the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. You're trying to avoid this, Lucas said, his eyes never leaving hers. But that only makes me want to come closer. Melissa opened her mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't form before she could speak. Lucas was standing right in front of her, close enough that she could feel the slight warmth of his breath, his eyes searching hers as if seeking answers to the questions she wasn't ready to voice. Why not? Melissa was unable to respond when Lucas asked in a quiet but insistent tone. I'm Lucas because I'm James's brother. Or is it because you're afraid to feel something you don't want to admit? His words pierced her defenses, striking at the very foundation of the walls she had built around herself for so long. For the first time, she didn't try to hide. There was no rejection, no denial, just vulnerability and a quiet, unspoken surrendering. Lucas raised a hand and lightly brushed his fingers against her cheek. The gentle touch ignited something inside her that she had been keeping buried for too long. I don't want to hurt you, Lucas said softly, his voice now warm and soothing, almost like a promise. But I can't stop. Melissa felt as though her feet were rooted to the ground, but her heart was racing, screaming for her to acknowledge the truth she had been avoiding. She knew that everything would change if she let this happen. But she also knew that she no longer had the strength to keep running from it, and then, before reason could intervene, Lucas leaned in. The first kiss was tentative like a wave brushing gently against the shore. But it carried the force of everything they had both been holding back. Melissa felt his arms wrap around her waist, pulling her closer. And she didn't resist. Every feeling of guilt, fear, and doubt melted away. Replaced by a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in years, the small room seemed to hold its breath, enveloped in the stillness that followed. Melissa didn't know how long the kiss lasted. But when they finally pulled apart, Lucas's eyes remained locked on her, steady and unwavering, as though waiting for her to say something. "There's no going back after this," Melissa said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I don't want to go back," Lucas replied, his voice firm and resolute. "Do you?" Melissa didn't answer, but she didn't need to. Her eyes said everything she couldn't put into words. And in that moment she knew no matter what lay ahead, no matter how uncertain or complicated it might become, this was something neither of them could deny any longer. The next morning sunlight filtered gently through the gaps in the curtains, softly casting its glow over the room, as if to soothe the chaos lingering from the night before. Melissa opened her eyes, taking in each slow, deliberate breath. The silence of the house was so profound that she could hear the chirping of birds outside the window, yet inside her mind, everything was far from quiet. She sat up, her gaze drifting absent-mindedly toward the clear blue sky visible through the window. Last night felt like a dream, a whirlwind of emotions that had swept her far from the principles she had clung to for so long. But now, with daylight bringing reality back into focus, weight settled in her chest. She wondered if what they had shared had been a mistake, or if it was in fact what she had always needed, but had never dared to confront. A soft creak at the door pulled Melissa from her thoughts. The door opened slightly, and Lucas stepped inside, still wearing the same t-shirt and jeans from the night before. His expression held a quiet intensity, as though he was grappling with something important. He stopped when their eyes met, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face before being replaced by resolve. "Melissa," Lucas said, his voice steady but gentle, "I need to know, do you regret it?" His question was like a needle piercing her mind, and Melissa sat in silence, trying to find the answer. She didn't regret it, but she couldn't ignore the fear that had taken hold of her. She was afraid that what had happened might destroy their fragile bond, and that she might be hurt again, just like she had been before. "Lucas," Melissa started, her voice trembling, "I don't regret it, but I'm scared. Scared that we're crossing a line we can't come back from, scared that this could end up hurting us both." Lucas stepped closer, his unwavering gaze fixed on Melissa. Melissa shook her head. "No, but that doesn't mean we should continue. You're so young. Lucas, you have your whole life ahead of you and me," she said, her voice catching as if her own words were too painful to say aloud. Lucas sat down next to her, taking her hands gently. Melissa looked into Lucas's eyes and felt her heart tighten. He was right. She did feel that unbreakable connection between them, something she had never experienced with anyone else, not even in her failed marriage. However, she also knew that this wasn't easy and that the price for what they had started could be steep. "You have to understand that this doesn't just affect us," Melissa said, softening her voice. "Do you really think I care about any of that, about age, the past, anything else? The only thing I care about is you. And I know you feel it too. I don't know if I can risk it again." Lucas nodded as though he understood the depth of her fear. He didn't argue or push further. Instead, he held her hands a little tighter. His calm and reassuring presence was incomprehensible. He said, "I won't ask you to make a decision right now, but I'm not giving up. You deserve happiness." Melissa didn't answer, but she couldn't stop the faint glimmer of hope that flickered within her. Lucas stood alone in the room. He didn't press her or demand anything from her, and that more than anything else made Melissa realize how different he was. He wasn't James. He wasn't anyone she had ever known. Her mind was a storm of emotions as she painted, but the canvas came alive with colors unlike anything she had ever created before, bold, chaotic, and full of raw emotion, much like the state of her heart. By the time evening arrived, Melissa found herself standing in front of the painting, her eyes tracing every stroke of the brush. Lucas didn't expect her to be someone she wasn't. He just wanted her to be herself. The rest of the day passed in a haze of restless thoughts. when she realized she couldn't continue to live in fear and run away from her feelings. Melissa left her studio and went outside to the porch where Lucas was sitting quietly. He looked up at her, and a moment of surprise crossed his face before it calmed down and became more steady. Melissa sat down next to him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. At last, she said in a quiet but determined voice, "I don't know what the future holds, but if you're willing, I want to try." As Lucas stared at her, a gradual smile appeared on his face. The road ahead was uncertain and possibly full of challenges. But for the first time, Melissa wasn't afraid that this wasn't an ending. Rather, it was a beginning of courage, trust, and love unburdened by the past. He said, "I'm always willing." And Melissa felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years as they sat side by side under the quiet night sky.